Good morning, everybody. My name is Marcia. Hi, and I want to welcome you all to the convention and tell you how glad I am to see all of you. It's been great for me so far, and of course a lot of people I know, and it's always exciting to see out-of-towners. And I'm kind of the Toastmaster MC or whatever to introduce our speaker for today. And we'll open with a moment of silence followed by the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Is Joe here? Joe, would you like to read the 12 steps?
Yeah, no. The 12 steps of Nar-Anon family group. 1, we admitted we were powerless over the addict, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all our affairs.
When I volunteered myself to do the introduction, then I thought, well, how am I going to do this? And I remember early on when I was in the program, I wrote in my ODAT the word how. How do we work this program? And the way we work it is honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And that's what I thought of when I thought of our speaker today, Goody, what his presence in the program has meant to me. When I came in, he was, quote, one of the old-timers, and those are the 3 qualities he possessed. He had honesty, that self-honesty that is required of us. And he, of course, is open-mindedness, because nobody stays in this program and listens to all we have to listen to unless you have an open mind. And he is always willing to share with others. And I think of the program, kind of 2 groups of people, the newcomers and the old-timers, and what they each give to me. And the newcomers always give me a shot in the arm and always wake me up and always make me appreciate where I've come from. And the old-timers like Goody always are there for me, and they're always a step ahead of me or several steps ahead of me, and they help me to understand the 12 steps, and they help me to do the recovery work I have to do. And that is what Goody has done for me when I've been at the meetings that he has been at also. And so I really appreciate the fact that he accepted our invitation to speak today, and I know that we're all going to enjoy it. Thank you. Goody?
Thank you, Marcia. After an introduction like that, I think that I'm not the only one that has some expectations to work on. And I would like to correct you on one thing. and this was something I got corrected on at the first meeting I ever attended. There are no old-timers in this program. So I'm glad that brought some laughs, because what I have to say usually is not so comical. I don't tell jokes well, and don't have any lined up to tell. Once in a while, some of the things that we look at when we're talking about ourselves do have some humor in them. And I hope that we can all appreciate those when they do pop up in what I have to say. I was thinking over what I would try to say today and the points I would try to make. And I came to realize that no matter what I plan, it's not going to work out that way. That's what I would like to do. There are some points that I would like to make. There are some things that I would like to say that I thought about, and I'm sure that maybe some of them will come out. There are some that won't come out. And one of the great things about being able to speak to a group like this is that there's always something that comes out that I have no idea that is even there, much less that it's going to come out. So I hope that something I have to say will be of use to someone in here. I'm going to toss out a bunch of cliches that you've heard before. I'm going to do some reading out of some of the material, and hopefully it won't be too boring. But it all is part of what I hope to convey during this talk. One thing is that just for today, I will adjust myself to what is, and not try to adjust everything to my own desires. I will take my luck as it comes and fit myself to it. I'm doing that by being here. Okay, I'd ask that the thought for the day from the ODAT be left for me to read, and I've got that and a couple of other things that I want to read to start off with, simply to set the stage. And then I'll try to get into a little bit about myself and where I came from, as they say, how it was like, what happened, and how it's like now. From the ODAT for today: losing my temper. Call it an attack of anger. Can be a disease too. It afflicts many of us before and even after we come into Nar-Anon. We try to cure this disease by applying the Nar-Anon program to our thinking. The symptom of the anger sickness is an uncontrollable impulse to judge and condemn someone else. In this emotional explosion, I am really asserting that everything I think and do is right, and everything the other person does is wrong. If I were not sick when I denounce and accuse, I would at least realize that the momentary relief I get from this outburst is poor pay for the consequences I must bear. I learn in Nar-Anon to be good to myself. Am I not ill when I allow anger to destroy my poise and peace of mind? When I lose control, am I not handing over the control to the one I'm treating like an adversary? Can anger ever express love? I pray for the quietness to help me cure my own emotional instability. Let me use serenity to cushion the impact of whatever happens outside me. And then from another daily reader that I have that is not conference approved, but it's today's reading. It never ceases to amaze me how appropriate these are for any given occasion. It says, we all wear masks, and the time comes when we cannot remove them without removing some of our own skin. The mask men wear are as varied as those who wear them, but their purpose is quite simple. We wear masks to hide our real faces from those around us, and even from ourselves. There are seductive mask, innocent mask, white knight mask, tough guy mask, black sheep mask, lone wolf mask, and many more. Sometimes we want to take on another identity so others won't see our insecurities. Or we think taking the form of someone else will give us power over others, or they will like us better, or we can escape ourselves. The cost of wearing a mask is not getting a chance to develop our real personalities. What mask are we attached to? Are we willing to give them up in the interest of our spiritual growth? And then from the little blue book. And this is some things that we don't read in the meetings too often. But when we do, they are very meaningful. Following this section on helping, it says self-pity blocks effective action. The more we indulge in it, the more we feel that the answer to problems is a change in others in the world, not a change in ourselves. Thus, we become a hopeless case. Exhaustion is the result when we use energy in mulling over the past with regret, or trying to figure ways to escape a future that hasn't even come yet. Likewise, setting up an image of the future and anxiously hovering over it for fear that it will or won't come true uses our energy and leaves us unable to live today. Yet living today is the only way to live a life, or to have a life. Take no thought for future actions of others. Neither expect them to be better or worse as time goes on. For in such expectations, you're really trying to create. This is God's job, not yours. When man tries to create another life, he makes only monsters. Love alone can create. Love and let be. Remember, all people are always changing. When we judge them, we judge on what we believe we know of them, failing to realize that there is much we do not know, and that they are constantly changing as they try for better or for worse to cope with life. Give others credit, even as all of us struggle. Give them credit for attempts at progress, even if their changes are not apparent. And above all, give them credit for having had many victories which are unknown. We're all of the same cloth, although a different cut. And remember, too, that you are always changing, and you can direct that change consciously, if you so desire. Yourself, you can change. Others, you can only love. Okay. I've got a couple of other readings that I'd like to add in later on. But right now, just step back a little ways into the past, or maybe a long ways, depending on where you are. I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, into what I look at now as, or think of probably as a lower middle class family. It was a family in which I don't remember any displays of affection, except on some very rare instances. I don't remember feeling love for either of my parents from the time I was 5 or 6 years old. Now, this was not an alcoholic home. There were no drugs. This was a home in which there was one bottle of booze bought during the holiday season. It would probably still be there the next holiday season. But there was something going on there, something I still don't know about, that influenced me early on. Best I can figure, there are a number of traumatic things that happened to me about the time I started school. And at least some of this I don't remember, or I shut out, or didn't know what it was. It's just a blank. But one of the things that happened was that when I started school, I'd been in this home where my dad was on a traveling job. He was out of town 4 days out of the week. And I was at home with my mother and 3 sisters, the youngest of whom was 8 years older than myself. When I started school, I was really a smart-ass kid. I knew a lot of things that other kids didn't because my dad had read to me a lot. And I wouldn't hesitate to let other kids know that I was smarter than they were. I got into a lot of trouble because of that. I had an unusual name, and that was the subject of ridicule by the other kids. And worst of all, I didn't know anything at all about what boys were supposed to know, because I lived in this household with the 4 women and a man who was there sometimes. It didn't take long for me to become a shutout, all right, in this way. I was on the playground. I was usually the last one to get selected to take part in the games. And after a little while of this, I became very much a loner and got into a lot of fights. And I lived in a fantasy world that shut out almost everybody else. There were one or two friends that I acquired during this time that stayed with me for a lifetime. But for the most part, I couldn't keep friends because I had a knack for leading other kids into situations that would get them in trouble, but I never got caught. I got a lot of mixed messages from church, from school. I was singing in church particularly, and I'd go to Sunday school in the morning, and they would teach Jesus Loves Me. I'd go to the church service afterwards, and it was a hellfire and brimstone sermon. You're going to hell if you don't straighten up right now. Didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Things just did not go together. I really did not relate much to the upbringing in the church, although I was continued to attend. But I was still the outsider. I didn't belong. I got into the Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. I didn't belong there either. I was a member, but I was not part of the group. I cheated my way through the Cub Scouts. I managed to make all the ranks, but I don't think I ever did very much of the actual activity that was required to make them. This didn't exactly endear me to my peers either. I got to junior high school. I was a very fat, chubby individual. And one of the things that happened, we had to take phys ed, and I get in there and dressing with the other boys, and I got kidded a lot because I had large breasts, larger than most of the girls in the class at that time. And this became a source of ridicule. Consequently, I wound up finding out that I could take band and I wouldn't have to go to phys ed, so I joined the band. And that was one of the miracles in my life, because I did enjoy music. I was never a musician, but it kept me in school. I probably wouldn't have graduated from high school without it. Speaking about these traumatic incidences that happened about the time I started school, there was another one that played an important part in my later development. And that was, there was a little girl about my age, lived across the street, and we almost got caught playing doctor one day. We didn't get caught. Her mother called her, and we wound up getting our clothes back on and getting out before she realized what was going on. But this was something that I didn't think anything much about at that point. But a couple of days later, it turns out that the story was all over the neighborhood. And when I heard the other kids talking about it, I figured, gee, I better tell my folks before they find out from somebody else. And I did. My mother's response was, don't you know her daddy could kill you for that? Psychological emasculation. And I say that played an important part later on. Since I had a very difficult time establishing any kind of a healthy attitude towards sex. I didn't date while I was in high school. After I got out of high school and into college, I did start dating some. But really, I spent most of my teen years and early adult years trying to avoid social contacts or anything that could lead me into a situation with a woman. I worked second and third shift a lot and just isolated myself. I had one girlfriend. This was a girlfriend that I dated when I was in college that went on to become an airline stewardess. And I saw her once every 3 years. There was don't build much of a relationship on that. Okay, I got in service and wound up going to Japan. I got over there just after the ceasefire in the Korean War. Up until this time, I had not been a drinker. I had a sip of beer when I was 3 years old and decided that wasn't for me. I might have had a hot toddy or two when I was a kid, served as a cold remedy. But just before going to Japan, I was at a point where I considered myself, looking back, to be amoral. I had drifted away from church. I really had no idea what right and wrong was. I was trying to intellectualize it, trying to have a reason for everything. I had no idea which way my life was going. At the time I was getting ready to ship out, the shooting was still going on in Korea. I had no idea whether I'd go over there and come back or not. I was at Parks Air Force Base waiting to board the ship. And one night, while I was there, I had gone out to the service club just to kill time. I'd been out there. They had some kind of entertainment. I was out there until they closed up. And I started walking back to the barracks. And as I did, I walked past the chapel. And I know my higher power was looking after me because for some reason that I didn't realize at the time, I just turned and walked inside. I walked up to the pulpit, and there was an open Bible on the pulpit. I wish I could say I knew what was there. I don't remember what page it was open to or what I read. But I got up there and started reading. I was in there maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And when I came out of that chapel, I no longer had any question about right and wrong. And I felt the greatest peace that I had known in my entire life. Now, this precedes the program, but it's part of what I am. And this stuck with me. I had this very conscious contact with God, or HP as I refer to him a lot of times now, because it seems like a more familiar term. And this lasted for about 8 months. I volunteered to assist the chaplain and had a real good period of time there. Then wound up at a squadron party. Well, as I mentioned before, I'd always been the outsider. I always felt uncomfortable in groups. And here I was in this party with 200 people. And I was very uncomfortable. And I also seemed to be the only one that didn't have a drink. So finally I gave in. And that was the evening I found out that I loved Scotch. Well, as time went on, I started drinking heavier and heavier. And it was very easy to do when the drinks were a quarter apiece or sometimes a nickel apiece, as they were over there. Don't recall that I ever got drunk but one time during this period of time, but it was, and it was not a serious situation at all, but I did, as I say, I acquired the taste. And with that taste for alcohol went my conscious contact with my higher power. It was over 20 years later before I was able to reestablish that contact. I was still searching for it. I was searching for spirituality, not finding it in any of the established churches. But I got out of service, and my present employer was hiring. They were hiring service-trained technicians, and the pay was good. It was a chance to get away from home, which I wanted to do. I'd always wanted to leave home. I really had trouble staying around my parents when I was there. But I got into this, and this was a fulfillment of a desire. Because when I started college, I had expressed an interest in computers. And my professor at that time, and most of my fellow students, told me there was no future in computers. Well, enough said. But true enough, there were very few places that you could learn anything about computers at that time, and there were somebody along about that time that said that there probably would never be more than 50 built. Well, as it turned out, I was flunking out of college. I was there for a year and a half, and I could see the writing on the wall that I wasn't going to be able to come back after the next semester because my grade point average would be so low. And I could salvage that by withdrawing and going into the service, which is what I did. So when I got out of service, I was able to hire on with a computer manufacturer. I got my training in computers, and that's been my life since then. Fulfillment of dream number one, unplanned, but it worked out that way. I didn't have anything to do with it. Later on, I mentioned the girlfriend that I saw once every 3 years. She was living in New Orleans. I was in New York. And I decided I wanted to get where I could see her more frequently. I wrote up a request for transfer, carried it into the office, and when I carried it in, I walked past the bulletin board, and here was a notice on the bulletin board. Anyone who wants to transfer to Huntsville, Alabama, apply. Well, this was when we were getting started in the Apollo program. And this became fulfillment of another one of my dreams, that I'd always wanted to be a part of putting a man on the moon. And I was, a very small part, but I was a part of that program. Nothing of my own. Coincidence? I don't think so. I don't think there are any coincidences. I wouldn't have said that years ago, but I do now. It was while in Huntsville that I got in with a group that liked to party and met my wife. And we circulated with this group where we did a good bit of drinking. And it seemed like fun times. She had 2 children who at the time that I met her were 8 and 13. And I fell in love with the whole family. We dated for a couple of years, and during this time I observed that she was popping a lot of pills, which was the in thing at that time. If you remember, in the 60s, the doctors all felt that there was a chemical cure for everything. And this was a source of a big resentment for me because later on, because it seemed like it was really counterproductive. During this time, I started seeing a psychiatrist myself because of the problems I was having on the job. He asked me how much I drank. I told him moderately, without explaining that moderately to me was the equivalent of about 4 highballs a day on a daily basis. He proceeded to prescribe some antidepressants and tranquilizers, and no word of warning. I was talking to the psychiatrist and telling him about this woman that I was seeing and how much I loved her and that I wanted to marry her. But I would never tell him everything that was going on because I figured he'd tell me not to marry her. Honesty didn't exist. But we continued dating for about 2 years, and when we did get married, it was for the worst of reasons, perhaps. She had told me one day in a conversation, at least implied, that she was considering a murder-suicide involving the children. And at almost the same breath, she indicated that she was finally willing to marry me. You know, I'd been asking her for some time, but making no progress. Well, it was a couple of weeks after that that I was in Norfolk, Virginia. I'd driven up to go start a vacation, and I called back to talk to her. And she said that she wanted to go ahead and get married. We had talked about it, but we hadn't really done anything. And I said, well, when I get back from the vacation, we do it. She said, no, you got to come back right now. And she says, I always get married on August 29th. Okay, are we sick or not? Anyhow, turns out she had been married twice before, and each time it was on August 29th. So I returned. This was the evening of August 27th. I returned to Huntsville. We made all the arrangements on the 27th, and we were married on the 28th, rather, and we were married on the 29th. An explosive situation right from the start. She had a lot of physical problems, and at that time these really put her under the weather. She was bedridden for about 3 months early in the marriage. We finally got her physical problem diagnosed and being treated, and it seemed like the communication was almost non-existent between us. I don't like thinking of myself as being mean to the kids, but I did mistreat them in many ways, a lot by ignoring them. And as communication just vanished in the marriage, we had been together 7 months when we split up the first time. As it turns out, during the first 6 years of our marriage, we spent less than 2 of it living together. There were a lot of reasons for this, but a lot of it was just that when we were together, we were like oil and water. There was one occasion in which I'm sure that I would have killed her if it hadn't been for divine intervention. We got in a fight. Now, this is a woman that weighed less than 100 pounds. At the time, I weighed about 220. And I say that was divine intervention because I had sense enough to break off and get out of the house. The kids at this time were there. They were living with us at that point, but they were being ignored for the most part. They were going to school. They'd come home. They'd do their homework and whatever they had to do. I got involved with the Boy Scouts briefly. I spent some time with my stepson. The daughter was a cheerleader in high school, and we went to some of the games with her. But by and large, they were on their own. There was very little supervision. The circumstances got bad enough in 1971 that my wife finally conceded that she would be hospitalized. But she insisted that she had to come to North Carolina Memorial. Now, there was some history to this. Her history in therapy and with the drugs and so forth dated back quite a bit before our marriage. And it was difficult with us living in Huntsville, bring her up here and to go in the hospital. She got up here, and I no sooner got back to Huntsville than her doctor was on the phone and wanted to know what the hell she'd been taking. Because she had gone into severe withdrawal symptoms when she was admitted to the hospital. Of course, they took her off of everything. I spent the next day going around to several different drugstores to find out what all she had been taking. So I wasn't aware of all of it. I was aware of one prescription that was probably the worst, and that was a prescription for Valium. A prescription for 60 milligrams a day. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Valium, but 5 milligrams of Valium puts me out. And this was a woman that weighed less than 100 pounds. And she had later admitted that prior to going into the hospital that she had been skipping a day and taking 120 milligrams as a single dose. and were we on a roller coaster. She was complaining at that of not being able to sleep. I didn't know at that time that she was getting drugs from more than one doctor. So there's really no telling what all was being consumed at this point. It was always prescription drugs or over-the-counter stuff. She never got into street drugs, but that doesn't make a difference. It's the same kind of pattern. And there was always a drinking going along with it. You can imagine that 120 milligrams of Valium in a half a bottle of wine. You know, it was not until years later that I was able to refer to her as an addict. Talk about denial. I was in denial. I was in denial about myself. I was wearing those masks. To the outside, the people at work, I seemed to be doing fairly well, but in my private life, everything was a shambles. After she was released from the hospital, she chose to stay up here so she could continue her therapy with the doctor she was seeing. I stayed in Huntsville for several months more. And during this time, the kids were abandoned, literally. I saw to it that they had enough money to get some food, buy groceries. My daughter was a senior in high school at the time. But I was living in a house trailer a couple of miles away from the apartment where they were living. Their mother was up here. In that period of time, if I was ever in a blackout, that seems like a period of time when I was. I don't know how much I was drinking during that time. It wasn't heavy drinking, I don't think, at that point, but it was drinking. And I certainly wasn't being a dad to those kids. The daughter graduated from high school and started to college in Alabama. The son, he didn't decide. He was asked to come up here to stay with his mother, and he did for a while. A few months later, I got a request to transfer to New York. This was another traumatic situation. I came through Chapel Hill on the way to New York, and she asked me if I wanted them to come with me. And I said yes. So as it worked out, the 2 weeks following Christmas, she and both kids came up and spent some time with me in New York. After 2 weeks, she said, "I'm not coming up here to live." And she returned to North Carolina. The next several months, I made numerous trips back and forth. The son called me one time and said that he had taken his mother to the hospital, that she had fallen and hurt herself. Another time, he called and just asked me to come down in a hurry without any real explanation. He said he needed me. And now I was in a situation, how sane was I during this time? I'd take off, I'd drive 300 miles and then call back and tell my manager I wasn't going to be in for the night. This went on for a period of time. Finally, she prevailed on me to try to get a transfer down. I'd originally said I'd try to get a transfer down after a year so that I'd have my moving expenses paid and so forth when I did get it. But it didn't work out that way. It was 9 months, and I did manage to get a transfer. But to do so, I had to step into a lower position. It set me back about 10, maybe 12 years on my career path. That was a source of resentment, a big one. I look back on that move now as being the best move I ever made. Was I in control? No way. But it did put me into a position to learn a lot of things that I needed to learn. I got down here, and we lived together in an apartment for about 3 months, and she decided that she didn't want me in the apartment, so she asked me to leave. I went out and got an apartment. When I came back, all of my belongings were sitting out on the porch. We stayed in touch, though, and we even saw a counselor together during that time. And somehow we managed to get back together. We bought a house where I'm living right now and moved in together. We had some fairly good time during that period. Along toward 1979, it got to a point where I'd come home from work and she would be almost in a stupor, about ready to pass out. During this time, she kept asking me if I thought she was an alcoholic. I don't know where I got the knowledge, but somehow it came to me, I'm not supposed to tell her that. And I told her that she'd have to decide that for herself. Long in here somewhere, our son confided in me that the reason he didn't come home from college often was, and he was only 15 miles down the road, but he didn't come home often because he never knew what to find, and because of his mother's drinking. So I relayed that information to her. On Labor Day of 1979, she contacted someone in AA. On the following day, she asked me to drive her down to the meeting. And drove in, and her sponsor met us, took us in, got us a cup of coffee, and then she grabbed me by the hand. She says, "There's a meeting for you across the hall." And she took me into an Al-Anon meeting. I'd heard of Al-Anon, and even within the past few weeks prior to this, considered going to Al-Anon. But I hadn't made up my mind to do so. I went into that room that evening, and there was a lot of things that happened. And I have to beg your indulgence here because I have trouble separating the programs. Nar-Anon has been very important to my recovery. But I had a lot of Al-Anon before I got to Nar-Anon. And it is the same 12 steps. At that first meeting, I was a bit apprehensive initially, but before the evening was over, I realized I was among a group of people that I felt comfortable with. And probably the first time in my life. I was 45 years old. I look back on that now, I tell people sometimes that I felt like you could just cut the love in that room with a knife. Because it really came through like that. I got a lesson in anonymity that night. And I think anonymity is very important. But the way it came across was that there was a lady in that room that was describing in considerable detail how she had planned to kill her husband. And the thought ran through my mind, if they can talk about something like that in this group, they must take this anonymity thing seriously. I listened intently as the steps and traditions were read. I didn't hear anything new. What I heard there, I'd heard someplace before, but it was sure put together differently. The reading for that night, and I would like to read it, and this, because it seems so appropriate. And I didn't remember it. I can't say that I remembered it from the time I first heard it, but I know it was read that night. And I know when I went back and reread it, it was extremely meaningful to me. It says, some of us, after long enduring misfortunes we didn't know how to cope with, reached a breaking point. In our hopelessness, we even felt rejected by God. So we never thought of turning to Him for help. The wonderful thing about Nar-Anon is that we are encouraged to renew our faith in a power greater than ourselves. We may have thought that we were beaten, but we have merely forgotten that God has given us the strength and the means to hold up our heads and live. We learn once more to identify ourselves with the divine principle that rules us all. The knowledge that God is always with me and expresses Himself through me will guide me in every difficulty. This is a source of confidence and strength that will help me to face life in an entirely new way. Came through very strongly. Well, subsequent to this, my wife's sponsor tried to get her to attend the normal 90 meetings in 90 days. And, of course, I was called on to chauffeur a lot. So I wound up going to almost that many meetings myself. I don't think we made 90, but we probably made 75 or 80 in that 90 days. A lot of these were open AA meetings. There was at least a few of these meetings were in other 12-step programs. But I found the same message throughout. I found that I identified very closely with the alcoholics. And one of the miracles, another miracle that happened was that I had my last drink on that Labor Day of 1979. I'd have told you then that I never felt a compulsion to drink. And I'd have been lying. Because subsequent to that, I did feel that compulsion. And there have been a lot of times where if I didn't have a meeting to go to, I'd probably have been drinking. Well, needless to say, going to that many meetings, that's an intensive dose of 12 steps. And I'm a person that needed it. I'm still a person that needs a lot of meetings. I still attend 4 or 5 meetings a week in one 12-step program or another. And I'll probably continue doing that most of my life, if not all of it. Well, anyhow, things did get better. For a while there was at least abstinence from alcohol within our family. But the pills continued. And after my wife picked up her red chip after 90 days, she announced that the holidays were coming up and she was going to have a drink. And that was the end of it. One thing I will say is the drinking never returned to the level that it had been previously. But the pills were there. Later on, she was to find a therapist that was not an MD and therefore could not prescribe pills. She still found the source for the pills through her internist. And the internist admitted to me later that she had really had the wool pulled over her eyes. And I thought that was great that she could admit it. Well, my wife was hospitalized several other times in subsequent years. And it seemed like that things just kept going downhill for me. My financial situation deteriorated. At the time that I came into Al-Anon, I was under general anesthesia. I had no feelings. Now, I'd shut down on feelings early on because back as a kid, I found that it wasn't healthy to express my feelings. I was taught, like a lot of little boys, that good little boys don't get angry and little men don't cry. I was just shut down emotionally at the point that I came into the program. Gradually, I started regaining some feelings. I'd like to say that the situation at home progressively got better, but it did not. It progressively got worse. And I consider these years, the first 5.5 years plus that I was in Al-Anon, to be my life preserver years. I was hanging on to the program. I was going to a lot of meetings. I was trying to apply the 12 steps to the best of my ability, but I wasn't detaching. I was still very much caught up in it. I did not want to abandon this woman who was unable to hold down a job and for whom I cared a lot. But the situation just continued deteriorating. In June 1985, I had been telling her for some time that I wanted to take some time off to myself take a vacation alone. The circumstances had not been such that I could. My work situation at that point was one where we were involved in a very busy time at work. I was unable to get time off, and it was just a bad time altogether. But she insisted that I leave, that I go ahead and take the time off, that she needed to have some time to herself also. So I did. I moved out and went over and visited my sister in Virginia Beach for the weekend, and then took a room in a motel for a while. But the day that we separated, or the week that we separated, I was invited on Friday evening to a party at the home of my manager, where I realized that I was going to be one of the few, if not the only one, who would not be drinking. So before going to the party, I called the Al-Anon number in Raleigh and asked where I could find a meeting. Somebody got mixed up, because when I got to the meeting and asked for Al-Anon, I was told, no, this isn't Al-Anon, this is Nar-Anon, but you're welcome. And that was probably one of the greatest things that could have happened to me at that time, because here the drinking was no longer as much of a problem as it had been. The pills were. And I hadn't been able to find very many people that could relate to this kind of situation. And I found the New Horizons group in Raleigh, which is my home Nar-Anon group. I wasn't able to attend a lot of meetings during that time because I had to take a second job with us being separated. I stayed in the motel for 2 months, and well, after the first couple of weeks, when I came back home, expecting to come back home, I found that there were deadbolts on all the doors, and I was told that I was not going to have a key, but that I could live there as long as I would, quote, behave myself. And this was a valid thing because, see, I mentioned the anger early on. I've been carrying around a lot of anger since I was a kid. And it would come out in these explosive situations where I became very destructive of property. I will say that we never came to blows after we moved to this area, and I'm thankful for that. But I could create a lot of havoc, and this was enough to instill fear in her. So she had a valid fear. And I couldn't argue with that at all. Well, as it wound out, I did move out. I took an apartment. I took a second job. Financial situation at that time, I was on the brink of bankruptcy. Every credit line I had was extended to the limit. And this was a situation that, in my old way of thinking, would have been unacceptable. I would have been ready to kill myself. And that is where I say that the program saved my life. Because without the program, I'm sure that I would have done that. As it worked out, about 2 months after we were separated, during the period of time which would be almost exactly 6 years from the time I attended that first Al-Anon meeting, I woke up one morning and the phrase from the Lord's Prayer that says, "Give us this day our daily bread," was running through my head. It stayed with me all day long. Everything I was doing that day, that phrase was there. And that was the day that I took my serious third step, 6 years into the program. We don't all run on the same timetable. I get very resentful sometimes about some of you that come into the program and spend a few weeks and really seem to have it down and working it real well. So it didn't come that way for me, even with all the meetings I was attending. It was during that time I could have these little mini third steps that I would take, where I could turn something over for a little while, and I'd take it right back. Just as soon as things seemed to get a little better, I was back in control. My situation at this time started getting better. Nar-Anon played an important part in that. I was still going to my Al-Anon meetings, and as well, and the thing is, I was meeting new friends, and along about this time, there was a man that I considered one of my sponsors that made the remark to me. I told him that I felt that things were going to get better, but I didn't know how. And he said, well, they will get better for you. This was probably the most painful period of my life. So I watched my wife's health deteriorate, physically and mentally. February of 1986, I went with her to a joint therapy session. Her weight was under 70 pounds and still dropping, apparently. And we talked about the possibility of getting her into an eating disorders clinic at Duke. And the therapist suggested that since that was very expensive and we were already in financial difficulty, that maybe it would be best if she'd come to my apartment and stay for a period of time where I could make sure that she had something to eat and try to take care of her. I'm good at taking care of people. Yeah, sure. Here again, the program to my rescue. Because when I look back over the period of time, she stayed with me in the apartment for 6 weeks. And during that period of time, and looking back at the things that went on in that apartment during that 6 weeks and the way she moved in and took over, I couldn't have handled it without the program. She was completely out of touch with reality. And while she did put a little weight back on, she was still doing a lot of crazy things. And I'm sure I was too. It was hard for me to see myself at that time. Actually, that was a period of about 6 weeks, after which she disappeared one day. She took off to go to her therapist's appointment on a Wednesday and didn't come back. On Saturday, I was about ready to file a missing persons report because she had already talked about the possibility of just disappearing, going off someplace and assuming a different identity or something. And I drove by the house and her car was in the driveway. So I stopped and went in, asked her where she had been. She had had some car problems, and the strange thing was that she hadn't called me to fix them. But she had set about on her own getting the problems with the car repaired, including finding a warranty that was in the glove compartment and taking it back and having a starter replaced under warranty. Something she never had done before. She had never taken that kind of responsibility. So that was kind of a good sign, maybe, but nonetheless, there was still a lot of craziness. Easter Sunday rolled around, the end of March, and she asked me to take her to church that day. And I did, and it was like taking a small child to church on a beautiful spring day. She was acting like a 4-year-old or younger, just describing in detail everything she saw and how beautiful it was. Extremely painful day for me, because she was most of the time out of touch with reality. Sometimes she would bring some things in that let her know that she was there, but I had to leave her early in the afternoon. I couldn't stay with her the whole day. And later she thanked me for the best Easter that she had ever had. It was a couple of days later, on April 1st, I went by the house to deliver some income tax papers to her. And she didn't answer the door. I walked inside, and she came staggering out into the hall and says, "I think I've overdosed." Well, initially I asked her if she wanted me to call the rescue service. She said no, and then she wanted me to go see if I could get some Epicac from one of the neighbors. I tried that. Couldn't know the neighbor wasn't home. But when I came back, I asked her if she wanted me to take her to the hospital. She said no, she felt like she needed somebody in attendance. So I called the rescue service. They came out and took her out to North Carolina Memorial. That was in the morning, well, in the early afternoon. It was late that evening when the doctor finally came out to me and told me that she had regained enough sense to decide whether she was going to stay in the hospital or not. But she refused to go in the hospital at North Carolina Memorial. And he told me the only thing I can do is to refer her to John Umstead. Well, she went to John Umstead and was there for 7 weeks. And there she found the first doctor I was ever aware of who told her that she needed to get off of everything. She came out of John Umstead after 7 weeks, clean and sober. She went around visiting friends and told them how happy she was finally to be off of all these drugs and alcohol. The week before, she'd been out on pass and she had attended our grandson's birthday party. And our daughter later told me that it was like having her mother back again. She was released from the hospital on Friday. The following Thursday morning, she shot herself. I found her on Saturday morning. You know, things have changed. They didn't get a whole lot better. I didn't really know where I was. But here again, I could draw on the strength that I get from the program. The people in the New Horizons group and the people in the Al-Anon groups that I attended were right there to support me. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget the support I felt at that time. Like I say, the children were out on the periphery during this time. I didn't know what kind of a relationship I had with them. They were both grown by now. They were out on their own. But we'd never been able to sit down and talk together very much because of all the problems that my wife and I were having. But I can say today that they came to my support. The relationship I have with those stepchildren today is one of the greatest gifts I've ever had. We are family. Now I can look back over my entire life at this point, and I can honestly say that I'm grateful for everything that ever happened to me personally. I'm not saying I'm grateful for my wife's death, but I'm grateful for what happened to me as a result of having known her. She had a lot of good qualities, and they got overshadowed by all the bad stuff that went on, but they were there. It's taken me the last 5 years, to really try to work through some of the problems. Now, like I mentioned, there were a lot of things. I could not observe my own behavior during this time that she was being hospitalized or that we were having all the problems in those last few months. One of the things that disturbed me was that during the time that she was hospitalized, we would have conversations, and there would be things brought up in the conversation that I was supposed to know, and I wouldn't have any idea what she was talking about. And I just kind of wrote it off, that, well, she's not really in touch with what's going on. Or maybe I questioned my own sanity. Rightfully so. Well, 3 years after her death, I found a steno pad at the house. It was still laying on the floor where it had been shortly after I moved back into the house. And in it was written a letter to me. It was dated during the first few weeks that she was at the hospital. And in that letter, she said a lot of those things that I was supposed to have known about. So now I know. She felt she had communicated to me. She had written them to me. It was never delivered. But some of the things that she wrote about, though, were describing in a very objective way what my behavior was like during that period of time. If I had found it earlier than I did, I wouldn't have been able to handle it, because I was not emotionally ready for it. But when I did find it, in God's time, it spoke to me, and I was able to relate it to what had been going on. I'm very thankful that I didn't just clean house immediately. There have often been questioned about the fact that I stayed in the house and had a lot of stuff around that dates back that far. But every once in a while something pops up, and I can appreciate it because of the program, because of the 12 steps. I think I've digressed here. I got too much into my story and not enough into what's going on. Right now, in addition to saying that I can be grateful, now this is that attitude of gratitude that they spoke about when I first came into the program, and I couldn't understand. So what the heck is an attitude of gratitude? But I understand it now. But in addition to that, I can look back and I can say that there is not a single person that I have ever encountered in my entire life that I would not be happy to see if I should meet them on the street. I might have to make some amends, but I'd be grateful for the opportunity. This program does work miracles. And I can't say that everything is perfect today. My favorite definition of serenity is living peaceably with unsolved problems. I have a lot of unsolved problems. My life is not perfect. But that doesn't keep me from being happy. It doesn't keep me from enjoying what I do have. We talked about the how of the program, the honesty, the open-mindedness, and the willingness. I don't know that I'm totally honest. I'm wearing a mask. I don't know what my mask is today. But there are things that I haven't said. And all I do know is that I'm not the person I was yesterday. I'm not the person I'm going to be tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow will be better. I think it's important to keep in mind that the 12 steps are the program, that everything else is auxiliary to that. I can't say, I will not claim to have worked any of the 12 steps. I will not put it in the past tense. But I try every day to apply the steps as well as I can to my life. I think there is something in each of the 12 steps that can be applied at any given time. I think on deep analysis that you can find all 12 of the steps embedded in each other, in any one of them. I just try to run very briefly through the steps the way I view them. Step 1. Admitted we were powerless over the addict and our lives had become unmanageable. Replace the word addict with anything you want to. My life was unmanageable. There's no question about that. Somebody that's under general anesthesia can't manage anything. And I was very ready to admit that I was powerless. Step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And because of my own conditioning, from that incident back when I was getting ready to go overseas, I never had a doubt that God existed. But that conscious contact had disappeared. And hearing that step and realizing that, hey, all I had to do was be willing to accept the help that was there. And I could be restored to sanity. The process is ongoing. I'm not there yet. I still do a lot of insane things. Step 3, made a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understood Him. Like I say, it took me 6 years to really do that justice. And it's something that I have to do on a daily basis now. I make the decision. And I try to go through with it. Sometimes I succeed and sometimes I don't. Step 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Now, I characterize myself as being a non-writer. So I have to confess, I've never taken a written inventory. But I've done an awful lot of soul searching. I've uncovered a lot of character defects. I've uncovered a lot of good characteristics. And there's more being revealed every day. Step 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Yes, I have done that too. And it's been piecemeal, honestly. Not been a one-time thing. And some of these things I go over and over. And as things are revealed, I go into them. It's an ongoing process for me. Step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Words entirely and all cause me some problems. Because some of these things that are considered to be defects I want to hang on to. I'm comfortable with them. But I know, intellectually at least, that I need to get rid of them. On the gut level, it's a little harder. Step 7, humbly ask God to remove all these defects of character. And that is something that I have to do on a regular basis. As I identify the defects, I have to ask that they be removed. Notice that this step doesn't say, ask Him to help us remove them. It says, ask God to remove them. I think that God gives us the strength and the ability of whatever we need to do what we need to do. Step 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Here again, because I don't tend to write things down, I can't say that I made a written list. But I certainly have gone back over my life and addressed a lot of people that I've wronged. For me, making the amends, which is step 9, has been a little bit of a problem because most of the people that appeared on my list were either dead or geographically unavailable. So making the direct amends became difficult, if not impossible. For those that were available, specifically the children, I feel like that I'm making an ongoing amend. The fact that they accept me now and that we are family is evidence to me that that's working. My parents being deceased, my wife being deceased, I have trouble getting there. And for these, all I can do is say that I try to change my attitudes and my actions to match up to my highest standards and try to relate to other people in ways that will bring about different results than I had with them. Step 10, continue to take personal inventory. And when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. It's an ongoing thing. I usually paraphrase this continually to personal inventory. Because it's not something I do once a day. It's something I try to do continuously. And when I find myself in the wrong on something, I try to admit it, and if necessary, to make any amends that go along with it. Not always successful, but I try. Step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him. Steps 10 and 11 are a couple that I latched on to almost immediately. You know, a lot of people say you've got to work the steps in sequence. This may be true, but like I said before, I think that any of the steps can be applied at any given time. And I wasn't ready to make an inventory early on, but I could, on a daily basis, at least keep from making it bigger than it would have been otherwise, and keep from making my amends list bigger. So I was able to grasp onto that and use it. The prayer and meditation to establish my conscious, or to improve my conscious contact with God, I realized the need for that immediately when I came into the program. And I grabbed onto that step. I started using it. I can't say that I was a daily prayer at that time, but and I can't say that today. In one sense, I am. In one sense, I'm praying all the time, because there are always thoughts on my mind, things that I'm thankful for, and I'll say a little prayer of thanks. Especially things like some of the beauty of nature that I see now, that I can acknowledge and say, yeah, thank you, God, for letting me experience this. Because a few years back, I wouldn't have experienced it. So the conscious contact with God has improved. And step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. That phrase, in all our affairs, is something I latched on to early, too. And it seems to have worked to some extent, because the people that I worked with got easier to work with within the first 30 days I was in the program. And I was trying to practice what I was hearing. The spiritual awakening, we could have a whole meeting on that, or dozens of them. What is a spiritual awakening? How does it come? I've heard it said that we have a spiritual awakening anytime that we hear something said that is meaningful to us in a meeting. I think that God speaks to me through each and every one of you. I think that each of us is part of God. And God dwells in each of us. I've had spiritual awakenings come in the form of things that I've heard at a meeting that I'd forgotten. I'm never able to quote something someone said when I leave a meeting. 6 weeks, 6 months later, I might be able to, because I have a need for that information that was conveyed at that point. That's a spiritual awakening. My incident with the Lord's Prayer, when I said that I took my serious third step, that was a spiritual awakening. That was one of the lightning bolt variety. And they occur too. So I think that I feel like I have experienced all of this. I feel like I do use all 12 of the steps to the best of my ability on a daily basis. And by doing so, it helps me to keep the focus on today and try to keep my life in order. I'm the happiest today that I've ever been in my life. I'm physically the healthiest today that I've been since I was a teenager. For that I'm grateful. And I feel like I owe it all to the 12-step program. I feel like I've just about run out, but I wanted to close with something from the little blue book again, and something that I have found to be very useful to me, very useful thought, and something that helps me keep everything on course. It's on the first page, first thing in here. It says, "Look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. In its brief course lie all the verities and realities of one's existence. The bliss of growth, the splendor of action, the glory of action, the splendor of beauty. For yesterday is but a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But today, well lived, makes every yesterday a dream of happiness, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Look well, therefore, to this day." Thank you.